But I'm wondering, first of all, about you, Andy, your distinctive piano playing, that Dixieland sound which you put on so many of the tracks. Where did you pick that up? Where did you learn to play in that style?
Well, I've always liked that sort of music, and I somehow taught myself to play, not very well, I'll admit, but by watching the hands of my father when he played the piano, and one of my teachers when he played the piano, I sort of worked something out from it, but I never had a formal training.
So, but it was something you obviously you enjoyed doing, because when you hear these tracks, the Dixieland pieces are so beautifully woven into them. I mean, was this all part of the plan? Each record you would do, there would be the Andy Newman bit?
Well, I think this was all really down to production genius of Pete Townshend, who had the songs of Speedy in his background, and also he apparently heard a lot of my music before that, and he sort of weaved it all in as a sort of a, I don't know, sort of a, what do they call that, a mosaic? I don't know. Because
it was Pete Townshend and Kit Lambert who effectively put the band together, and from what I know, and you have to clear this up, you only met Speedy Keen and Jimmy McCulloch on the actual day you recorded Something in the Air. That was the first time you'd met.
Right. I had not met Jimmy before the session. The first time I met him was in the studio. I'd actually met Speedy about a week before. He came to my place and asked me if I'd do it.
So what did Pete Townshend say to you? He said, "Look, this is a one-off gig. We're going to record this record." Or did you know, by the time you were recording Something in the Air, that he was getting a band together?
Well, as is usual in all these things, it's not quite so simple as that. Originally, Townshend had mind putting us together to make some music for a film that was being produced by a colleague of his who was doing a sandwich course between Bristol University and the BBC Western Region in Bristol. And we were just putting these skeleton numbers together for consideration for the soundtrack, which would later on be elaborated. It turned out that the film, it took place, but they didn't use the music. But Pete thought it would be a good idea if we put this together. The guys in the band wanted to form it into a group anyway, because Jimmy had come down from Scotland, and he wasn't doing anything at the time, and Speedy wanted to get a band together. So they approached Townshend, said, how about getting a band together, and Townshend contacted me and asked me if I'd like to do it, and I said yes. So then sometime around Christmas, I think it was, in 1968, I suddenly got a phone call to go over to IBC Studios in Portland Place, where we put together the basic tracks of the actual records that got released. Not only three of the numbers. That would have been what later became Something in the Air, Accidents, and Wilhelmina. The Hollywood Dream album was done later on.
And so when you were putting these tracks down, had you come up with the band's name by then? How did that come about?
No, there was no thought of the band's name at that stage. It was after the tracks were completed and they decided they were going to do something that they had terrible problems thinking of a name to give it.
Right.
I think the first name, I don't know, they had a number of names. One of the names was My Favourite Freaks, but that got thrown out.
Right.
And then what happened was that they had a sort of a deadline coming up because they'd sort of made the arrangement, done the assignment with Polydor, who were the company on which the lease tape that Track Records worked had, and they had to come up with a decision. I was then notified that the band had been named after my nickname.
Why were you called Thunderclap?
Well, it was my school friends in the latter part of my secondary education who called me that because they thought the rather clumsy style I played on the piano was reminiscent of a lightning bolt. Although they didn't put it quite so diplomatically as that.
So Thunderclap Newman, they're at the IBC studios, they lay these tracks. Then Something in the Air is released, and I understand that you and Speedy and Jimmy kind of had already got past this stage. You didn't think much would happen with it, did you?
No, we didn't. What actually happened was they decided to put us out on the road. We'd been sent round to this house in Hampshire called the Corn Mill, the old Corn Mill, basically to rehearse and get a road band together. We were then joined by a bass player called Jim Avery, and as a quartet, we started a tour. I think the first gig was the Kirk Levington Country Club between Darlington and Redcar. At that stage, something terrible had happened. The record had already been released. We didn't think it was going to go anywhere, but we were told just before the gig that it was in at number 27, which really scared us, and which is the reason why the place was absolutely packed, and we did our very best to try and live up to the recording, but I'm afraid we weren't quite that well rehearsed.
So how did it get into the chart? Because you're an unknown outfit. Did one of the radio stations pick it up? Who was plugging it for you?
Well, it seemed to be plugged all over the place. I mean, I think the BBC were certainly playing it. I think I think the Pirates were finished by that stage.
Yeah, they'd gone.
So it would have been principally the BBC. But I think one of the things that kicked it off was we got a live airplay on a TV programme on BBC Two called How Late It Is. Mm-hmm. And we were called back for a second week to go on there. So obviously there'd been some sort of... So I think this TV programme helped a hell of a lot. Mm.
So what were you doing at the time? Were you a full-time musician? Because for a while you were a technician with the telephone company, weren't you? Did you give it all up when Thunderclap...
No, I was in fact a telephone engineer when we made the original recordings.
Right.
And I have to frankly confess now that I did something in the air in the firm's time. I was supposed to be working on the job, and I was actually in the studio recording it, so please don't tell anyone, will you?
Well, I'll just wait for a response from British Telecom, and we'll see what happens.
No, I don't think... You don't need to worry about British Telecom. It was their predecessor.
Oh, it used to be the post office, didn't it? Used to be the
That's
post office
right,
running the lines. So, Thunderclap Newman, they go into the charts, eventually topping the charts, and you remained there for 3 weeks. How did life change then? Because this, like so many songs in the 1960s passing the charts, this one has had a life of its own, hasn't it?
Well, to us, it was like absolute bedlam. I mean, we were just sort of doing this music, and suddenly the whole world all around us was going crazy, and we were being lauded left, right, and centre, and people would come up to me. This is a person who'd never been really in the professional music business before, as I was the person who knew how to pull hits out of the stratosphere, which just wasn't true. And of course, we didn't really come up with anything like as sensational as Something in the Air after that. One of the difficulties, of course, is that it's very difficult to repeat something like that twice. I'm of the opinion that if we'd have started this thing 6 months before and had that on 6 months before, it probably wouldn't have got anywhere, and it probably wouldn't have got anywhere 6 months after. It just so happened at that particular moment in time, everything came together, and that just happened to be the right moment for that particular song. I think there was destiny behind it to some extent.
And as I say, it has had this incredible long life, because you still hear it on films, television programs. It kind of is a picture to this era, the 68, 69 moon landings. Weren't you playing actually on the moon landing night? Weren't you doing something special?
Yes, we were. We were doing a venue called The Place in Hanley in the Potteries, and we went on to do our set, and the promoter came up to us and said, "Look, will you please stay on, because I want to announce when they land on the moon, because we're following it." Right. They didn't have a big TV screen in those days. I suppose today they would have a big TV screen covering the thing. And so we carried on. There was an interesting little after story behind that, which was Jimmy's brother, Jack McCulloch, who at that stage was playing drums in the band. Speedy had decided that he couldn't front the band from the drums, so he was playing rhythm guitar and fronting it from the front sort of thing, and Jack was on the drums. Their father actually was working for a big company in Scotland which designed transmissions. And you know that thing that moved the Saturn rocket?
Yeah.
At the time, the biggest vehicle that ever been built. It was his company that had designed the transmission for that.
So he was watching...
So they had the McCulloch brothers had a personal sort of stake in that new moon landing. And in a sort of a...
It must have been very exciting for Jimmy at the time, because Jimmy was about 16 or 17, wasn't he?
No, he was 14.
You're joking, was it? What?
He was 14 when we first started. I think he was 15 when we started going out on the road. He really should have still been at school.
How did he get away with that? I mean, was there any tension with his family?
I don't know. I've no idea of the internal affairs of the family. I would assume that he was getting some education because he could read and write. He was perfectly literate, and he was a very intelligent lad. But certainly he was very, very young. And, of course, it was very hard to believe this because his ability and his professionalism on stage belied his youth. You know?
Yeah. I mean, it was such a... And he went on to show the incredible talent he had, in the following decade, but all ended so tragically.
That was a terrible tragedy, dying alone the way he did.
Yeah.
Yes, it was very sad when I heard that.
We're talking to Andy Newman from Thunderclap Newman, Mr. Thunderclap Newman himself. We're going to play something in the air. You can stay with us for a little while longer, can you, Andy? Because we want to ask you a few more questions, if that's okay. And, let's hear it. Let's hear the song we've been talking about for the past few minutes. That huge worldwide #1.